Beneath the asphalt of Los Angeles lies more than just a network of pipes and cables. There are bones, frozen screams, cursed animals caught in a deadly trap. Once, mammoths roamed these lands, saber-toothed cats stalked their prey, and early humans hunted for food, and many of them met the same fate. The tar at La Brea remembers everything. It swallowed millions of creatures and preserved their remains as priceless relics. For thousands of years, La Brea remained silent, but now it's revealing what it's been hiding for so long. Today, it will finally share its most chilling secrets. What kind of life can survive without light, water, and oxygen? How are scientists resurrecting wolves from ancient legends? And is it possible to solve a murder committed 10,000 years ago? All this and more in today's video. The creepiest graveyard of Los Angeles. At first, the La Brea Pits were just a source of bitumen. Native peoples even used the material for sealing boats. By the 19th century, the material was already widely applied in construction, as well as for roofing and road repairs. But everything changed in 1875 when geologists noticed bones trapped in the tar. The first articles about these finds appeared, sparking lively discussions in scientific circles. A few decades later, in 1901, geologist William Orcutt discovered the skull of a saber-toothed tiger and other remains here. It became clear La Brea was a treasure trove of scientific discoveries. At one point, school children were doing their first training excavations. And in 1912, the University of California launched large-scale research. Over the next 3 years, scientists excavated 96 pits and recovered over 750,000 fossil specimens of plants and animals. The pits where excavations took place were called quarries and were numbered for convenience. Today, the site is home to Hancock Park and the George C. Page Museum. Every year, more than 400,000 visitors come to see with their own eyes what the world of Southern California looked like 50,000 years ago. So, what is it hiding inside? Well, the discovery in Quarry Number 10 is one of the most remarkable. In 1914, workers stumbled upon human remains there. A skull, jawbone, and several other bones were unearthed. A true sensation. This was the first, and to this day, the only human remains found in the La Brea Pits. Radiocarbon dating revealed that the remains belonged to a young woman between 18 and 25 years old. She died about 10,000 years ago, during an era when mastodons still roamed the earth. She was of small stature, about 4 feet 8 inches tall. The skull also preserved teeth, which allowed scientists to examine the enamel's microstructure. Essentially, the types of foods she regularly chewed. Tiny scratches and indentations were found on the teeth, the kind that appear from stone-ground flour. What did this mean? Most likely, the woman lived in a community that knew how to process grain, grinding it with a cornstone. Yes, 10,000 years ago, people lived in what is now Los Angeles. And it seems they possessed far more advanced technologies than one might expect from that era. But what kind of tribe could it be? There are no definitive answers, yet judging by the age of the find and the shape of the skull, some anthropologists suggested that she may have been a woman of the Chumash people. Thousands of years ago, they lived in Southern California. Their settlements stretched from the Malibu coast to Santa Barbara and the northern Channel Islands. They had their own system of exchange and trade, using shells as currency. According to official records, their modern population is around 2,000, but 10,000 years ago, it may have reached as many as 10,000. Even more fascinating is that the Chumash were seafarers who built an engineering marvel of their time, the Tamal canoe. These boats were crafted from sturdy planks of redwood or pine, bound with plant fibers and generously coated with bitumen for waterproofing. They used boats to navigate the Pacific waters along the Southern California coast and the Channel Islands. But one mystery remains. How did the La Brea woman die? The first thought is an accident. Perhaps she slipped, fell into the sticky bitumen, and couldn't escape. But no, a piece of bone is missing from the upper part of her skull. This means that she may have died from blunt force trauma. Yes, this can be a murder case. Interestingly, dog bones were also found at the same place. For some time, scientists thought the dog might have belonged to the woman, but new research in 2020 showed the animal had fallen into the tar roughly 7,000 years later. So there was no common connection between them, though that only added to the story's mystery. But La Brea has always been full of surprises, and the deeper researchers dug into the pits, the more spectacular the discoveries became. One of the most astonishing finds in the tar pits turned out to be a mammoth. Its remains had lain underground for about 37,000 years and were almost completely preserved. And what's more, they were discovered completely by chance. In 2006, while building an underground parking garage for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art near the tar pits, workers struck something hard with an excavator bucket. It turned out to be a mammoth skull. Excavations began almost immediately. Numerous archaeological treasures were uncovered at the site: skeletons of ancient animals, fragments of trees, turtles, snails, and even ground squirrels. To preserve delicate remains and continue research in laboratory conditions, they employed a clever method. Blocks of soil containing fossils were cut out and transported to the museum in large crates. The usual research routine followed. The mammoth's bones and skull were carefully cleaned by hand with brushes to remove dirt and tar. Some elements were then restored using thin Japanese paper and glue. The finds included the skull, ribs, part of the pelvis, and most of the mammoth's limbs. Only one hind leg and part of the spine were missing. The upper portion of the skull had been damaged by construction equipment during the discovery. But the most astonishing part was that both tusks, each about 10 feet long, were preserved. That is an extraordinary rarity. Tusks are composed of dentin, which is more fragile than bone, making such finds extremely uncommon. In this case, however, the tar acted as a perfect preservation medium. The discovery caused great excitement. It's worth noting that 34 mammoth remains had already been found near the La Brea Tar Pits. But those were fragments, sets of bones from different individuals, with no complete skeleton. Zed's skeleton, by contrast, was roughly 80% intact. The giant was named Zed. Why? Quite logically, Zed became something like the final letter of the alphabet among mammoth discoveries. A kind of ideal, the rarest and most complete specimen one could ever hope for. Analysis revealed that Zed was about 48 years old at the time of his death. He hadn't yet reached the species' maximum lifespan, as mammoths could live up to 60 years. His ribs bore signs of old fractures that had healed over time. Perhaps they were wounds from battles with other males, or maybe Zed was simply a bit clumsy. As for his death, the likeliest scenario is that the mammoth went to the stream to drink, failed to notice the treacherous trap, stuck, and died from exhaustion or suffocation. Today, Zed is the star of the Page Museum at the La Brea Tar Pits, displayed at the very center of the exhibition. And here's another animal that, if not for La Brea, would have remained shrouded in mystery: the saber-toothed cat. Over 130,000 fragments from more than 2,000 smilodons have been found in the tar pits. Why so many? Because the sticky tar pits acted as a double trap. Herbivores would get bogged down in the viscous pools and slowly sink, making sounds and emitting scents that attracted predators. But as they ventured closer, they too were trapped and ultimately died alongside their potential prey. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the smilodon was often called the saber-toothed tiger, or even the saber-toothed lion. At the time, scientists were guided mainly by its appearance, a large predator with enormous fangs. But with the discoveries at La Brea and more detailed research, it became clear that the smilodon belonged to the Machairodontinae subfamily. The thing is that feline skeletons are lighter and more flexible, with distinctive skull structures and cutting molars, jaw kinematics, and retractable claws. Still, you wouldn't want to meet one of these kitties in the woods. Even the smallest species, Gracilis, weighed up to 220 pounds, while the larger Smilodon fatalis reached up to 620 pounds. What's more, its shoulder height could reach 39 inches. If one of these beasts stood on its hind legs and put its forepaws on your shoulders, it would tower well above you. A truly formidable beast. Saber-toothed cats lived from 2,500 million years ago to 10,000 years ago and roamed across North and South America. Smilodons hunted bisons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, and even young mammoths. Fossil evidence also suggests that Smilodons were unlikely to have been solitary. Some bones discovered at La Brea showed healed fractures, meaning injured cats must have been cared for by others. And the sheer number of predators caught in the tar simultaneously hints at social behavior. They may have lived more like lions, in small but tight-knit groups. They would ambush prey together and strike suddenly from cover, using their powerful paws to hold it down and deliver precise, lethal bites with their long fangs. In short, this was an animal that inspired fear, but the next predators to be found at La Brea were no less terrifying. And here's another symbol of La Brea, the dire wolves. Yes, the very same fearsome beasts from Game of Thrones and other fantasy stories, but they aren't fiction. Around 10,000 years ago, dire wolves really walked the earth. Their bones have been found across the entire continent, from deserts and grasslands to forests and mountain regions. But it was at La Brea where a record number of remains was uncovered. Over 4,000 individuals. Why so many? The answer is simple and obvious to us now. Dire wolves hunted in packs. First, they would spot an animal trapped in the tar, which looked like an easy meal to them. Several wolves would approach the struggling prey, only to get stuck themselves. Then their pack instinct kicked in, and more of them joined, until the whole pack was lost in the pit. In other words, if the whole pack went out to hunt, they all ended up caught together. Thanks to these remains, scientists have been able to trace the evolution and lifestyle of dire wolves. It turned out that they lived from about 125,000 to 9,500 years ago. They were larger than modern wolves, with a more massive head and more powerful jaws. Their skulls were broader, and their bite force far surpassed that of any living wolf. On average, they weighed between 132 and 150 pounds, though it's estimated that some giants reached up to 240 pounds. Their body length was also impressive, almost 5 feet from nose to tail. Of course, their prey was also large. Their main diet included bison and ancient horses, and sometimes even sloths. No, not the kind you're thinking of, but more on that later. And yes, those wolves faced a problem familiar to every stray dog: broken teeth. This shows that they often had to gnaw bones clean, scraping out every last bit of food under intense competition. For a long time, people thought dire wolves were simply bigger wolves of the past, but in fact, they weren't direct ancestors of today's wolves at all. They're a separate, extinct evolutionary branch. That's why they were placed in their own genus, Enoceon. By the way, you may recall the sensational news that scientists resurrected dire wolves. Colossal Biosciences bred 3 puppies named Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi. They edited 20 genes of their DNA to make them resemble dire wolves. But these are not ancient predators. They're genetically modified gray wolves. The company didn't bring back dire wolves, but rather created genetically altered gray wolves. Today, the museum holds more than 3.5 million specimens, but dire wolves occupy a special place here. Around 400 skulls are displayed together in a massive installation known as the Dire Wolf Wall. It's a powerful reminder of the hundreds of packs that once roamed the plains of Los Angeles. And here's another astonishing creature whose remains were found in tar: the sloth. But not the familiar little tree dweller that we know today. No, ancient sloths were true giants. Some species were so large they could rival modern Indian elephants. For example, one of the largest Erytharium weighed up to 9,000 pounds and stretched nearly 20 feet long. To put this into perspective, a person of average height standing next to it would look like a schoolchild beside a bus. However, such giants were not found in the La Brea Tar Pits. In this region, scientists most often encountered Harlan's ground sloth. This species was somewhat smaller than its relatives, reaching over 10 feet tall and weighing around 2,500 pounds. Still, it'd be hard to call that small. Its size was comparable to that of a large modern bear. Studying the bones revealed many details. Ground sloths had broad pelvises, sturdy limbs, and powerful claws, which they used for both defense and foraging in trees. When rising up on their hind legs, they would brace themselves with their tails, forming a stable tripod. And yes, they were herbivores. What's more, unlike modern sloths, their ancient relatives may have lived in groups. Ground sloths roamed what is now Los Angeles during the late Pleistocene, roughly from 110,000 to 11,000 years ago. There's a claim that some survived until the 16th century, based on the writings of French traveler André de Thèves, who described similar animals. However, this hypothesis lacks scientific support. Most likely, the travel saw ordinary sloths, and his account later inspired illustrators to depict giants. But why did these giants go extinct? Around 11,000 to 10,000 years ago, North America experienced a major environmental filter that affected many species. We've already mentioned this in one of our earlier videos. During this time, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant beavers, horses, and camels disappeared from the continent. Along with them, the ground sloths also vanished. The culprit was climate change. Glaciers retreated. It became drier and warmer, and vegetation shifted. Large herbivores had more difficulty finding food. And there was another factor. By this time, the first human settlers had already arrived in the Americas. They hunted actively, and slow-moving ground sloth would have been an easy target. But there was another animal capable of bringing them down. And it was Jaguar Panthera onca augusta. At first glance, it might not seem too impressive. After all, jaguars still roam South America today. But this one was in a completely different league. A modern jaguar typically weighs around 170 pounds, while its Pleistocene relative reached 234 to 284 pounds. This species was discovered in Nebraska back in the 19th century, when scientists unearthed a jaw fragment and a tooth. At the time, they had no idea they had found one of the largest cats ever to roam the continent. More discoveries followed, in Florida, Oregon, Tennessee, and, of course, the Brea Tar Pits. It's easy to guess that the site became a real trap for this predator. The giant jaguar lived during the Ice Age, a legendary time when mammoths, camels, and massive ground sloths lived in North America. In other words, the predator's table was always set. But as large herbivores began to disappear, so did this jaguar. Simply because it was too big to survive on small prey, it needed substantial game to sustain itself. Its anatomy suggests it could subdue prey far exceeding its own mass, which raises an intriguing question. If it had survived to the present day, could it compete with tigers? Or perhaps it might have become the king of the jungle? Yes, alongside such enormous and powerful creatures from the Brea Pits, other small finds may almost fade into the background. Specifically, small beetles. Thousands of tiny fossils have been found in the Brea Tar Pits. Over 180 of these specimens have been carefully studied. Scientists identified 7 species of ground beetles and darkling beetles that were especially well preserved. Among them were desert darkling beetles of the genus Eleotis, adapted to arid conditions, as well as Cicindela hemorrhagica and Cicindela oregana ground beetles. All of these species can still be found today in the open landscapes of Southern California. These beetles may be tiny, ranging from 0.2 to 0.8 inches, but their scientific value is enormous. Radiocarbon dating shows that these species lived here during 3 periods: 28,000 to 50,000, 7,500 to 16,000, and around 4,000 years ago. Their nearly continuous presence indicates that the area's climate remained relatively stable, except for a brief cooling during the glacial maximum. Once that ended, the beetles returned. If this land had ever been covered by humid forests, insects adapted to such environments would have also been preserved in the tar, but none have been found, clearly showing that such forests never existed here. Today at the George C. Page Museum, You can see these tiny insects next to the massive bones of mastodons, and yet even the beetles look enormous compared to the next discovery. Because unique bacteria have also been discovered in the Brea Tar Pits, you might think, so what, bacteria are everywhere. But these ones are special. They're more than 28,000 years old, and somehow they managed to survive all that time in tar. Scientists identified over 200 species of microorganisms here. Many of them belong to entirely new families never seen before. One of them even turned out to be related to the radiation-resistant bacteria of the genus Deinococcus. Just so you know, these microbes can withstand radiation levels that would kill almost any other form of life, thanks to a unique DNA repair mechanism. They literally stitch shattered fragments of their DNA back into a functioning genome. Other bacteria discovered in the tar turned out to be true masters of adaptation. They can survive in conditions that seem utterly inhospitable to life, with almost no water and little oxygen. Even more remarkably, they were found to have 3 entirely new classes of enzymes, capable of breaking down petroleum products. In other words, they literally feed on what is a deadly poison to most other living things. But the most fascinating part is that such properties can actually be used for the benefit of the entire planet. For example, we can apply them in bioremediation to clean up oil spills, to create alternative fuels, and perhaps even to develop new medicines. But how did scientists even realize that there was life in the Brea tar? The clue lay in the bubbles rising from the very bottom of the pits, nothing less than methane, and it's produced by special methanogenic bacteria and archaea. Instead of oxygen, they use carbon dioxide and release methane as a byproduct of their life. Thus, its presence was proof that microbial activity was thriving inside the tar. Scientists then collected a sample. To study the bacteria, they froze the tar with liquid nitrogen and ground it into powder. Then, they extracted DNA from it and used it to reconstruct the genetic profiles of the ancient microbes. But this is only the beginning. Further studies will focus on specific enzymes and could be used to benefit our planet. In a way, Brea can be seen as a secret incubator, a place where life managed to persist for tens of thousands of years under the most extreme conditions. But the Brea Pits also yielded another key to unlocking the climate history of Los Angeles: fossilized remains of plants and seeds. Researchers identified about 158 species of plants preserved in the tar pits, including fragments of wood, seeds, cones, leaves, and even pollen. All of these once grew in the Los Angeles territory about 50,000 years ago. Among the various seeds, scientists struggled for a long time to identify one particular type found in the tar. At first, they thought it belonged to some long-extinct, unknown plant, but microscopy revealed that it was actually Rocky Mountain juniper, a species that no longer grows in California today. Even more surprising, the pits also contained seeds of California juniper. These two species practically never occur together. It's almost like finding a palm tree and a sequoia side by side in nature. They belong to entirely different climate zones. So how did they meet? The answer lies in the last glacial maximum, about 26,000 to 19,000 years ago. During the cold period, Rocky Mountain junipers grew in the La Brea region. But forests didn't fully cover the land because the CO2 levels were extremely low, around 180 ppm. Such low levels barely supported photosynthesis, and plants suffered from carbon deficiency. This was part of the overall dynamics of the last glacial period, when cold oceans absorbed large amounts of CO2, and carbon was trapped in glaciers and permafrost. Today, things are very different. As the glaciers began to melt, the oceans warmed and released much of the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Ocean currents and wind patterns shifted. Los Angeles transformed from a cool, damp region into a warm and drier one. And drought-resistant California juniper replaced the Rocky Mountain species. Around 13,000 years ago, both species vanished completely from Los Angeles. Most likely, this was due to wildfires and climate change. The Rocky Mountain juniper disappeared because the surroundings became too hot, while the California juniper faded away as the climate became more temperate. Their traces remain only in the tar pits.